But what we'd like to do today is to just, provide some backdrop to the land and to the history, particularly focusing on the period during the time of Jesus and the early church, the evolution of the Gospels and so on, just as a way of helping us understand more about what we'll be seeing. Excuse me. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, just to get the. As Mark mentioned, Father Mark, one of the things when you go there, I don't know if anybody of you have been there or not, but it's sometimes called the fifth gospel, the land, the experience of the land and the culture. Obviously, the culture, speaking in general setup, the political, socio-ethnic makeup of the peoples there has evolved dramatically from the first century. And so too has the cities and the living situation, obviously the economy and so on. But nevertheless, particularly the geography is, for all practical purposes, the same. And the geography, the layout of the land, has a very profound effect on how people live and the events of history. This is sort of common sense, I guess. But in the Middle East particularly, as we'll appreciate, this is something like, you've been to Arizona, it's a dry, like Southwest type of situation. So water is a great premium. So water, for example, where there was a water supply, there's going to be civilization. And all of the great settlements and cities that were there in the ancient world, as we'll talk about shortly, all had to have a water supply. Under the Roman occupation that began roughly Roman influence around 40 BC up through beyond the first century, the Romans had the skill to bring water from great distances on their, bringing these in on the water supplies and into reservoirs. But prior to that, water had to be pretty proximate for people. So where there were natural springs, where there were small rivers, there's not many rivers in this region, that would be one determinant factor. Another very important factor was defensibility. These were unusual times for people. And so cities were normally built in a way that they could be defensible. Certainly the center of the cities. Many people lived out in the perimeters of the larger places, but at times of threat, of invasion, they would pull inside the walled parts, the fortified part of cities. And usually the governing authority had large granaries. We'll see one of these at Megiddo, for example. So they would have food and storage and water supply available. But the cities had to be built in a way that they could be defended. And the third factor, as we'll see about this area, it's sort of a rugged area. And so passageway, accessibility had a lot to determine where people stayed. Jerusalem is at one of the major passes. The same is true. Megiddo stands on a great pass. So does Hebron and all these other cities we'll talk about. They were places where people could travel and also that they could be defensible, perched on a hillside, and water. So just those things alone, natural canyons, passageways, water supply, terrain, really determined where people settled. Also, as we'll see, one thing about, you'll see this immediately, the United States has, we have the Southwest, we have Colorado, the mountains, we have the shores, east and west. We have the Great Plains. Of course, this is spread out around, 4,000 or 5,000 miles. Israel has all of those, but within about an area the size of New Jersey. Okay? So you move incredibly from one type of terrain and even type of climate to another type within a very few miles. It's quite amazing. It's the convergence, actually, of several geological systems come together. Both the Russian steppes come down, the African plains come up, and the Mediterranean world meets. It's really makes it quite striking visually, and also adds to some of the circumstances of the history. And because it was such a bridge, if you like, a land bridge between East and West, between the great civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, East and West, still, they're sitting over there talking right now. That made Israel, the land of Israel, the Holy Land as we call it, such a strategic place, such a battleground, such a passageway for the other major civilizations that go through. And that concentration of forces has a lot to do with the biblical history, as we'll see. I put together these notes just as little crib sheets for him. We'll more or less follow them generally. One of the things that's interesting about the region is even the names we use are highly politicized. Okay? We're going to be landing in the state of Israel, which is a modern state, as you know, from 1948. It's also the site of ancient Israel, back from around 1200 BC on down into the first century. And so modern Israelis, a Jewish state, claim that inheritance of the biblical history. But also living there are Palestinians. And Palestine was a name given to the region by the Romans when they invaded, and after the first Jewish revolt and after the second Jewish revolt in 132, we'll talk about those, the brutal suppression of Jewish resistance. And as part of the retaliation, they called this whole region Palestina, and it was from the word Philistine, okay? So that it was in a sense like ethnic cleansing. In fact, this is the case. After the second Jewish revolt, no Jew could come within 12 miles of Jerusalem. And it was completely renamed Aelia Capitolina, and it was plowed under and rebuilt as a Roman city. So Palestine, to call this Palestine, is not acceptable to Jewish people. They want to call it Israel. The Palestinians, on the other hand, don't like the name Israel given to what they consider certainly the West Bank and so on. We'll learn how all those things work out. They're confusing until you're there. They say, no, this is part of Palestine. So a way out of this, especially for Christian visitors, is to call it the Holy Land. Okay? We call it the Holy Land, a sort of neutral vocabulary that is acceptable to the people there. The notion of pilgrimage, the notion of coming, is sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And for all three major religions, Jerusalem in particular is a sacred place. For Islam, which probably has the most tenuous connection to Jerusalem, it is one of the three sites when you go on the Hajj, that you would go to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount. Of course, for Christianity, it's the connection with Jesus and the early church, and for Judaism, obviously, the Promised Land and the place of the temple. So a pilgrimage, a Holy Land, sacred places. This is one of the things that's very fortunate for us, is that there is a sense of profound hospitality and respect for people who come to this region to visit the holy sites. Okay? And our interest is in a way broader than visiting the holy sites. I mean, that's one of the things I tried to explain in the communication with you, that this is a pilgrimage in a sense, but it's also a sort of a study tour, not a grim study tour, but to learn about the history, including the current history of this region, which has such fascinating ties even to the biblical times. Some of the tensions that are there now have been tensions for a long time. So anyway, the concept of the Holy Land that we're visiting includes the state of Israel, includes the West Bank, includes Jordan. Jordan has several biblical sites, and they certainly think of themselves as part of the biblical history. So one of the things I put here is the general landscape. As I mentioned, this is sort of a confluence of several systems. I have some satellite photos to show you, but first, just to sort of situate, and you're familiar, I think, with a lot of this from just our general knowledge of things. But for example, this region in the north is the Galilee region. And then you have the central highlands. I'm going to come back to this, the Dead Sea. These two bodies of water and the Jordan River that joins them is sort of the defining backbone of the Holy Land. And this leads down off the map to what's called the Arabah. There's the land, the dry land that gradually ascends. The Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth, as you know, and it gradually ascends to it meets the Red Sea at Eilat and Aqaba. We'll be staying overnight in Aqaba. But one of the things that the personality of this land changes, and I put here east to west. We're used to seeing this sort of, north to south, this kind of view. But it's really on the east to west. If you start moving, where we come into the airport, this is an ancient, map of ancient Israel, okay, not modern, although some of the names are the same. Where we come in, you see Joppa. That's where present-day Tel Aviv is. Joppa has been sort of absorbed into, and the airport is just slightly to the east of Joppa, where we arrive. And this is the first great sector. It's sort of the Mediterranean coastal area. It's at sea level, it's sandy, it's loamy. As you move to the east, it begins to gradually ascend in elevation. And it's along this coast, by the way, that probably 80% of the population of Israel lives, in a series of cities all along this coast. And further in, just a little bit, about 10 miles, it's gradually rising, but it's still this basically sandy, loamy soil, is where a tremendous amount of citrus is grown. That's one of their major exports, is Jaffa oranges and so on, So a lot of citrus and a lot of flowers are grown. Those are the two major crops that Israel exports. So the first area here, going all the way up this upper Galilee, this is like the border with Lebanon. You see Tyre there? I don't know if you can read that. Tyre and Sidon, famous ancient cities that are now in Lebanon. And the Lebanese border begins right about here. And so you have these plains, the plains of Esdraelon, the plain of Sharon, the Philistine plain, all along the Mediterranean coastal area. But then I have this outline, as you move into going like from Joppa, and we would go to Jerusalem. That's going to be our first trip coming in from the airport. And you can see just on this map, you start to have more hills area. And the first set, like here, is called the Shephelah, the shoulders It's the foothills. And you start to go up. It's very beautiful through, not rugged hills, but certainly beginning of a mountainous area that runs along all here. In the ancient time, the caravans that would come from Egypt over here and up across through Syria, Damascus, into present-day Iraq and Iran, Mesopotamia, would follow this route, not right on the shore, because it was too sandy, but just a little bit in from the shore. And this is where the great caravan route, this is called the Via Maris, the way of the sea. Tremendous, importance for trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia and vice versa. All of these cities, you see here Gaza, Ascalon, Ashdod, Joppa, up here there's Dor and other. These were all fortified towns established by Egypt to protect the trade routes. Egypt, incredible economic outreach. So their might, Egypt's might, although they had military backing, their might was economic primarily. But they have a footprint here in Israel, ancient Egypt, that's still remarkable. So moving then, as we were, from west to east, we hit these foothills, and then we come to the central highlands. And this is a very significant mountain range. It's highest in the north and gradually lower in elevation as you go down to Hebron and then down here to Beersheba and down into what's called the Negev. We'll come back to that. The Negev, the southern desert area of Israel. But the central part is this highlands, and here is where a number of the key cities were set for defense, and also, as I was saying earlier, where there was water and where there were east-west passages, okay, so that the trade could go through here. So you have like Jerusalem, Bethlehem was not a significant city, but Hebron certainly was, ancient site of the monarchy. Samaria up here, very, very important. And then on up into the Galilee region. So that central highland is will be perched there in Jerusalem. It's about 2,200 meters above sea level where it will be. So at night it's cool in Jerusalem, even on very hot days. And then here's what's dramatic. You move further east from Jerusalem, only a couple of kilometers, and you start a very severe descent into the next defining sector, which is the Rift Valley. This deep, deep valley that has been cut by the Jordan River. The Jordan River that begins in the north, Mount Hermon, in the mountains. This is right on the Lebanese, Syria, and Israel border. Tel Dan, an enormous water supply that comes out there and empties into the Sea of Galilee and then runs down the Jordan Valley, dropping in elevation until the Dead Sea, the lowest point. And the Dead Sea, as you know, is not fresh water. It's dead. It's almost like viscosity. It's almost like becoming a solid. It's on the brink of becoming a solid. But this tremendous valley that is so deep, just drops off. And this is, you'll see as we talk about this, it's reflected in the Bible. Jerusalem, it's this region from where we started in the Mediterranean and coming up to Jerusalem. This is all arable. There's enough rainfall each year you go about a kilometer east of Jerusalem, and the rainfall stops, okay? And it's no longer arable, it's desert. Okay? And some of the Psalms speak of the treachery of the clouds that come in from the Mediterranean, and they hit the mountains around Jerusalem and evaporate. Okay? So this visuals are tremendous. It's everything you think about a desert. It's not the Sahara, but it's very barren as you go into this Rift Valley. And then finally, continuing our west-east trek, the other side of the Rift Valley is present-day Jordan. And it duplicates the hillsides on the Israel side. Okay, so you look across, as we will from Mount Nebo, we'll look across the Jordan Valley, and there you see Israel. That's where Moses, of course, had his last glimpse of the promised land from. So Jordan is like a match to this side. And what really happened, you see this little indentation here. This is where present-day Haifa is, and that's Mount Carmel, jutting out into the sea. And geologists say that what happened back eons ago, there was like a split in the land that created the Rift Valley. And there was a shift, and the portion on the left side, the west side of the Rift Valley, moved up, okay, and the right side moved down. Okay. So that now geological features that are matching are found about 1 kilometer off. Okay. So the east side and the west side, if you can imagine this going on. And this thing jutting out is part of this great geological piece that moved up and stuck out and created the great harbor of Haifa and Mount Carmel jutting out into the sea, which we'll visit. So as I mentioned, these places like Samaria and Jerusalem and Hebron, Nablus, other places were very important because they could go through this mountain range. Caravans and travelers could go through with less difficulty. Okay, so far so good, moving that way. But you'll see, it'll be very clear to you when we're there. The other way we can slice this, I don't know if you liked geography as a kid or not, but yeah, did you? Okay, good. All right, so these regions have such an impact again on the gospel canvas, if you like, and the biblical canvas. Up here is Galilee. And you notice it says Upper Galilee and Lower Galilee. That has to do not with north and south, but with elevation. Okay. Upper Galilee is very mountainous. It was always a place of refuge. After the Roman Revolt, for example, Jewish enclaves moved up into Upper Galilee. This is where Jewish mysticism was developed, and a lot of the codification of Jewish law took place. These are heavily wooded mountains still today, north of the Sea of Galilee. Okay? And then Lower Galilee happens to be part of a great plain. It's sort of delta shape. I'm trying to draw it here. Like from Mount Carmel down roughly to here, and then here and across here. This is the Great Plains of Esdraelon, or also called Jezreel. It's the breadbasket of Israel, still today. It was very much coveted in the ancient world as for its produce, to occupy it. Megiddo, you see Megiddo there, was one of the great Egyptian fortresses that sort of guards the entrances, one of the passes that goes from the Via Maris into the Jezreel Valley, and because it was so fertile and it's so beautiful. So Lower Galilee is dominated by this plain, and you'll notice there Nazareth. Okay? If Jesus was born in Upper Galilee, he and his family would be very isolated. Okay? But in fact, he was born in Nazareth, which was a small farming community, as we'll see, but it was right in the middle of the action. This is where all the caravans came up, and they crossed this way. They crossed around, went up the Golan Heights to Damascus and on to Mesopotamia. This was the route from ancient times, all the way back maybe 2600, 2800 BC. So this region here, it has, the soil is volcanic soil. And it's very warm, it's extremely fertile. They have 3 or 4 cuttings of barley a year in some of these regions. Yeah. So it's farming, it's lush, there's flat land for crops, there's water supply with Galilee, and this is where, of course, most of the gospel stories take place.
Are those farms irrigated, or is there natural rain?
They sort of a combination of both, depending on the region. In this region, they do get suitable rainfall, but you also see a lot of irrigation, this drip irrigation that in different places, because the rain is confined to the rainy season. So basically, from end of October to January, February, beginning of February is when you're likely to get rain. The other times, no. So
Like
there's
California.
that's probably sure, like the Southwest, I think. So they have to, you know, help things along in the dry season with some irrigation. But they have cisterns, they have water supply from the rain to help them. So Upper Galilee, Lower Galilee, then you move here and you see this section. This is part of this mountainous highlands. You can see it on the relief of the map. And this is Samaria. Traditionally, peoples alienated from the other Jewish people going back to the time of the exile and the rebuilding. And you move down from the north, so there's the central highlands, there's the Rift Valley we've looked at. We go down, and then right, Hebron, very ancient, important city, the original site of the monarchy of Israel, that you move down where Beersheba is. Beersheba is at sea level. And this whole region is called, in the modern thing, the Negev. It's a desert region. It goes down and into the Sinai. Okay. So you're moving from the north. The north is high, to ultimately the south, it's low. Okay. And so the north has a lot of rainfall, you know, just as we're talking. The south is very arid, okay, down in this region. And you eventually, as I say, get down all the way to the bottom, to the Negev. The Arava, this is that dry land. You know, if you read in the prophet Ezekiel, he describes the water coming out of the temple. He has this vision. If you remember this story, suddenly water comes gushing out of the base of the temple. There's a dream he has, and the water runs down through the Judean wilderness, through this arid area, and it comes, and it's so powerful, it cleanses, it makes the Dead Sea fresh, and it makes the Araba able to bloom, and there are fruit trees. And so this is his dream of the desert turning into, you know, and you can see it's reflecting what, in fact, is the arid conditions. Precisely, you don't have that kind of water supply today. So then, speaking of water supply, just going back to the notes, everybody holding out okay as we have our visual tour here. The water supplies. Israel surrounded in a way by significant bodies of water, not as an island, but bodies of water that became kind of demarcations. Certainly the sea, as it's referred to, the Mediterranean. Israel rarely occupied this area, ancient Israel. Under Solomon a bit, under the Hasmoneans much later. They were never sea peoples. The sea in the Bible is seen as a place of terror and threat. Your sea is so large, my boat is so small, as the psalmist says. It's a place of chaos. Baal, the god of the Philistines, is the sea god. The only famous sailor in biblical history is Jonah. and he doesn't have much luck. If you remember, he goes out to sea and gets tossed off the boat and ends up in a big whale and so on. So, but this was there. They were aware of this, and it takes on in the Bible, as I say, it evokes chaos. It evokes endless tracks. It evokes danger and threat. But they never were not familiar. They weren't familiar with it, like the Phoenicians or, the Philistines and other peoples that lived on the sea and made the sea their home. The other, of course, body of water that is very important in the gospel stories, because of this is where Jesus hung out, is the Sea of Galilee, which is fresh water. It's below sea level at surface. It's almost always warm and lovely. It can take a lot of storms can kick up there. It's like a bowl. It's about 12 miles long and 6 miles wide. It's very beautiful. And we'll spend time around the Sea of Galilee. And then, of course, the other demarcation is the Jordan River, which is a very modest river, as you'll see. But it is very important because it's a water supply that helps provide irrigation and so on for all this area. And then, of course, the Dead Sea. And the Bible is very aware of the Dead Sea. At the time of Jesus, we now know from archaeology, this actually was a fairly heavily populated area. And people used the Dead Sea, as they do today, to mine minerals and as a passageway back and forth. Had boats on it. And they're finding a lot of little inlets and stuff from this. Modern archaeology is spending a lot of time in this area. So the water supplies, the Red Sea that's not on here is down here where Eilat and Aqaba are today. And of course, that's another connection. The crossing of the Red Sea is part of this, is the eastern leg of the Red Sea, but it demarcates Egypt and to the Sinai Peninsula and the desert. So there's a lot of, even just these water bodies and the surrounding desert sets up a lot of the drama of the Bible. They were, in a sense, born in the desert peoples coming out of Egypt. And then, as the Exodus will see, they actually moved up this side of the Jordan Valley, and to about here. Mount Nebo is somewhat around here. No, it's actually further down. There it is, Mount Nebo. And they cross over at Jericho, according to the Bible's saga. But they came out of the desert and then come into possession of the land, land of milk and honey, so milk pasturing and honey farming, flowers and stuff. So they become agrarian, they become situated in cities, but they never forgot their sort of mythological origins as desert people. And a lot of times the reform movements in Israel, the prophets, they would go to the desert to sort of recapture the movement. The Qumran people have set up there. Jesus goes to the desert at the beginning of the gospel story. Elijah, great prophet, goes to the desert. It's like going out to the frontier or something, and cleansing yourself of the trappings of civilization and, breathing in the clean air and the challenge of the desert to prepare yourself to plunge back in to the arena. Cultural anthropologists have a lot of, deserts, seas, and mountains are always boundary symbols, for the sort of the stage of human existence. We won't get carried away too yet, though. So, then I put here, getting towards the end, the regionalization. So these areas, you'll see it today, because of the terrain, because of then the history, it gives a certain character to these regions, the human culture related to these regions. They're different geologically and geographically and climate and so on. But they also have an influence on events and on the peoples that settle there. So Judea, for example, the province of Judea is surrounding Jerusalem here. And Jerusalem, from the time of David, who succeeds Solomon, and one of the things David did, there was a traditional seat of the southern tribes at Hebron, where Abraham goes and so on. And then up here, Samaria, is where the northern tribes sort of gathered. So when David takes over from Saul, as the whole social structure of Israel is forming, he decides not to have his capital. He's from the southern tribes. He decides to situate the capital in between, in the Jebusite city of Jerusalem. That was never the capital. It was not even conquered during the conquest. It was held by the Jebusites. But David, somehow, we don't know exactly how he did this, is one of the intriguing things we'll talk about when we're there. He takes Jerusalem and makes it the seat of his monarchy between the two regions of the north and the south. And eventually, he brings the Ark of the Covenant there to his dwelling, so that he merges the political and religious symbols. The temple will be built here, and it will be the seat of the monarch. Okay. So from that time on, roughly 1000 BC, Jerusalem is the center, the identifying center of Israel. And it waxes and wanes in its fortunes, but it remains to this day Jerusalem. And Jesus in the gospel, when he's warned about Herod wants to kill him, he says, no prophet can die outside of Jerusalem. I must go on my course today. So Jerusalem was, that's where the action is. That's Chicago for Illinois, downstate and Chicago. So you have so Judea, very key because of Jerusalem. Okay, and the Jerusalem temple that Herod will build at the time of Jesus, it was started before Jesus' birth, but was not even completed during Jesus' lifetime. It was practically done. It was done only about 2 years before it was destroyed. It was completed in 68 AD, and the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD. But the Jerusalem temple, and that's why Judea has such, was the second largest human structure in the world at the time, exceeded only by Karnak, the temple of Karnak in Egypt. So we're talking big time here. And so Judea, the focus of Jerusalem. When the Romans take over after the death of Archelaus, the death of Herod, this may be more information you need, and one of his sons was Archelaus, who was assigned to this region. He's mentioned in the infancy narrative of Matthew, but he's extremely cruel and inept. And the Romans remove him. And from that time on, the Romans directly rule Judea and Samaria. The rest of the area they left in the hands of Herod's sons. But Judea and Samaria, around 4 AD, become under direct Roman rule, and they rule as something that's not even on here. Caesarea Maritima is where the Roman seat of governance was. And that's why Jesus was exposed to Roman capital punishment, because it was the only part of the country where the Romans directly ruled. Other parts were Jewish, under Jewish law. So Judea, and then Galilee, of course, as I mentioned earlier, lush, agrarian, beautiful land, flowers, crops, etc., certainly sets a tone. Samaria, because of history, was an alienated area. The Samaritans were not taken into exile by the Babylonians. And when when the Jews returned from exile, they considered the Samaritans as quislings and compromisers, and they did not let them participate in the reconstruction of the temple. And there was terrible cultural and historical animosity between them. You have the Good Samaritan story, of course, in the Gospels, and often people traveling in pilgrimage would not go through Samaria, Jewish people. They would go down the Jordan Valley, or they would take the coastal road and not go through the center of the Jordan Valley. We talked about this whole deep rift. This is, today there is agriculture here with a lot of irrigation. We'll see that, but it has its own. Then the Dead Sea area, stark, haunting, beautiful. The wilderness, it says there, of Judea, that will be in that region. The hill country, where Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, Bethlehem I mentioned to the north, you'll see a very distinctive area in the hill country. They did not have as much farming. They could do some farming, but cattle raising and so on marks this region. Then, of course, the Negev, the desert area, Gaza, Sinai, Egypt, all of those desert regions that Israel was aware of. So I put here finally on this part, and we can take a breather here, the gospel drama and the biblical landscape. Jesus is a northerner, okay? He's of Nazareth. And that's how he's identified some of the gospel stories, you know. Can any good come out of Nazareth? This area in Israel's history was first conquered by the Assyrians in the 8th century. And Assyria, which is roughly present-day Iran, the Assyrians, they get credit for the first ethnic cleansing. Okay? They really did move out large numbers, particularly the elites, out of this area, the people who were educated, the ruling class, and so on, and brought in other peoples, okay, to break the back of the conquered areas. They changed all of the boundaries, all of the taxation, all of the ruling class in here. And although later, under the Hasmoneans, this would be reabsorbed into the orbit of Israel, the north was always considered, not the center of orthodoxy was Judea. Okay? The north was sort of questionable. Okay? So Jesus is from Galilee, he's from the north. He comes south, first of all, in the encounter with John the Baptist, this reforming movement. And then, the Synoptic Gospels have him coming in one dramatic journey to Jerusalem. John's Gospel has him visiting Jerusalem at least 3 times, if not more. But Jesus was not a priest. He was not of a priestly family. He was a teacher, prophet, prophetic figure, and he was from an area of the country that seemed to be a little bit on the fringe. Okay. But what's ironic in the history of Israel, although Jerusalem is the center point, almost all of the reform movements in the course of the Bible's history come from the north. The Deuteronomic movement, the prophetic movement, Jesus himself. It's sort of like, it's like the outsider comes in and challenges the insiders. Okay? And so it's one of the acts of the drama. And then, of course, we have Jesus, as I mentioned earlier, and as you're aware, going into this desert region at the beginning of his mission, evoking Israel's own sojourn in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights, sort of cleansing himself. We have a lot of references in the gospel of him going to desert places. In the Greek, eremos topos, desert-like places, to sort of get out of the hubbub and so on. And then you have Jesus, as I say, in Jerusalem and Judea, his great challenge to the seat of orthodoxy and the seat of religious power, and also, as it happened, the seat of Roman power, as he moves his movement into that place. You're really going into the intense concentration, and he arrives there on Passover, when historians think the city swelled to 3 times its population. And so it was a dangerous move, as the Gospels present his action. So anyway, friends, this region, the distance here, say from the Sea of Galilee to Jerusalem, is about 95 miles. Okay, that's the distance you're talking. And from the coast, from Joppa to Jerusalem, where we're staying, is probably about 25 or 30 miles. So you're talking a very small arena here. And yet, as I mentioned, the personality of the land and the colorations of the populations here in the regions are all pressed into this small arena. So how are we doing so far? Are you doing okay? Yes, please.
May I ask a quick, or if it isn't quick, later maybe. So could you show us the path of our trip then, when
Sure.
we start and where we go first and next? And
Sure. And then we'll take a break. Okay, after that, so you have a break, and then we come back and more questions. Yeah, okay. So we land at Ben Gurion Airport. In Lod, every place you land, there's a biblical connection. Lod in the Bible is Lydda, and it's where, the person was listening to Paul and fell asleep and fell out the window. It's where Peter takes care of Dorcas and so on, but I won't get off into that. Okay, so we travel first to Jerusalem. Our first few days are in Jerusalem. We do, on one of those days, and some of these arrangements are for practical arrangements, okay? They're not all driven by, the sequence of the biblical story or something. We do go down to Jericho one afternoon, go for lunch, and sort of get that out of the way, okay? But for the rest, we're in Jerusalem. We go to Bethlehem also, West Bank, which is very fascinating. And then after Jerusalem, we drive down, we visit Qumran. We drive along the Dead Sea. We visit Masada, which is along the Dead Sea, Herod's great fortress. And we go down the Arabah, I guess I say off the map, to Eilat is the Jewish city, and it's adjacent, connected to the Jordanian city of Aqaba. We stay in Aqaba. We cross the border, go to Aqaba. And then the next day, we come up and go to Petra, which is not on this map, but it's in here somewhere. And we stay overnight in Petra. And then we drive up. We visit Mount Nebo. We visit a very interesting Christian city called Madaba. And then we go to the city of Amman. And then from there we go down and we stay on the Jordanian side and we cross over into Israel about here, this northern crossing. And then we're staying at a kibbutz guest house, which is wonderful, between the city of Tiberias, which is about here, and the city of Nazareth. So we stay about here. We're there, I think, 3 nights in Galilee. And we'll visit around the sea, depending on whether they let us go up there now. We used to always go up in the Golan Heights and view Syria, but there's been some tensions there. But we go around the sea, and we visit Nazareth, and we visit Capharnaum. We really have a wonderful visit there. And then on our way back, we'll visit Megiddo. We visit Mount Carmel. We come down, we visit Caesarea Maritima, which is one of the most spectacular sites in the country, where Herod built a harbor city there, and the Romans used it as their. And then we return to Jerusalem. And we have a couple days in Jerusalem, and then we head for Chicago. So we cover really, part of the rationale for it is by the end of the time, we will have seen all of the major regions and the major geographical lineup, and as well as seeing the major sites and some of the non-major sites. So let's just take a quick look at sort of the timeline, if you like, the history that, I don't know about you, but I mean, I have found over the years that our own education is very interested in the West, and we don't know so much about what happens in the Middle East and to the East. And so some of the historical decisive events that have shaped this history are not so apparent. And when you're, as some of you have been there, when you're in the Middle East and you're visiting various sites, I don't know what that is.
It's a phone.
Oh, it's a phone. Okay, sorry. I thought it would make sure it wasn't a fire alarm or something. But, you move from one, it's Iron Age, and then you're into the Arab period and so on. I mean, so the times, the posting of times are snatched from different areas. But if you look on your timeline there's these great periods of history, but the beginning of the biblical history, once you get particularly to the Exodus, is in the late Bronze Age there. You see they're around 1600 to 1200. The exact dating of the Exodus, which may have been a much more diffused event historically, not one single dramatic event as the Bible presents it, is somewhere around 1250 BC. And then Iron Age 1, 1200 to 1000, was a period in Israel's history called the period of the Judges. It was basically a tribal organization. These different tribes federated for purposes of defense and so on, but a very diffused, decentralized government. And it's with Saul around 1000, Iron Age 2, that you have the coalescing of what was they called amphictyony, a federation of tribes, into a monarchy. We'll talk about that and think about poor Saul. But David was the one that's attributed with the kind of shrewdness and abilities, had his own army, his own mercenary group and so on, was a power source all his own, that really established the monarchy in a definitive way. So from around 1000 BC, followed by Solomon, his son Solomon. But with the death of Solomon, both Solomon and David, as you can see, reigned a fairly long time. But at the end of Solomon, the original tensions and separation points among the tribal groups, especially the north and the south, fell asunder again. Okay, and you had the division of Israel into the north and the south, and the northern kings up in the region of. Just going to go back here to. In the region of Samaria, here was sort of the seat. Ultimately, it moved around a little bit, but Samaria was the seat of the northern kingdom of Israel, as it was called. And then the kingdom of Judah, was its center in Jerusalem, was the south. So this division happens after the death of Solomon. And then, as I put there, 922 or 7, that's when it breaks up, but in the Assyrians in 721 devastate the northern kingdom of Israel. And it ceases to exist as a monarchy. So it's only Judea left. And then you had the 586, the Babylonian captivity, when Judea itself, the southern kingdom, is devastated by the Babylonians. And there's a long period of exile, which has a tremendous influence on the Bible. The wound of the exile. And much of the Bible's literature was written in the wake of the exile. Okay. Then, again, hopping through just to get some of the highlights, a very significant event, 332, was Alexander moving from Macedonia. Incredible how that was all done. Conquering the Middle East. He arrived there in around 322, left a very deep impression by, salting the place, if you like, with his own generals and encouraging the marrying of Greek culture with local cultures, Hellenization. Greek influence, the notion of the city, the cult of the body, athletics, drama, language, all of these things started to enter in to the circumstances of Israel. After Alexander's death, there were two different Greek dynasties that controlled Israel. The first was the Ptolemaic, and the Ptolemies, their seat of operation was in Egypt, and they controlled this region, took tribute and taxes and so on, but really did not interfere as much in the ordinary life of the people in the region of the Holy Land. But they were succeeded by the Seleucids, who ruled from Damascus. And they, because they needed economic resources, they were trying to fend off the Romans, they made deep inroads into Jewish life, ultimately touching the nerve center, desecrating the temple, and so on. And I put there in 165 BC, incredibly, because the Seleucid dynasty was weakened by its struggles with Rome, and Rome was moving east and taking more regions here, that a revolt developed in Judea by the Hasmonean family. They were known popularly as the Maccabees, the Hammers. And they were able to overthrow the Seleucids, and they restored the temple. The Feast of Hanukkah is originally the Feast of Lights, is the purification of the temple after the Hasmoneans. And the Hasmoneans, look at the dates there, 165 to 63 BC. For the first time since the Babylonian captivity, 500 years before, the Jews were in control of their own destiny. Hasmoneans were a Jewish family, a dynasty. But what happened, the Hasmoneans, they actually spread the territory. They incorporated the north and the south. They extended the borders. They were very powerful. But they also began to be very corrupt. And by the end of their era, I put there 63, it's on page 2, there was like civil war and chaos, various factions and groups. The Hasmoneans were buying and selling the priesthood. This is where the Qumran group moved out of. Reform groups grew up, a lot of turbulence. And the Hasmoneans invited the Romans in to arbitrate. Okay. In 63, they came in and they stayed. Big mistake. They came to dinner and never left up until the end of 628 AD. So they allowed Herod the Great to be their vassal king, and Herod was very shrewd. We'll hear a lot about him and talk about him there in his monuments, but he ruled the entire region. Jesus would have been born probably 4 AD, during the time of Herod, at the very end of Herod's life. And you would have eventually, this is later, I have this in the context, you have the breakup of the Herod. When Herod died, the Romans did not want to have a single ruler again, even though a puppet ruler. So they divided it into three. And the characters in the gospel, Herod Antipas and so on, those are the sons of Herod the Great that Jesus deals with. Okay? And Archelaus, who was ruling in Judea, as I mentioned earlier, one of the three sons of Herod who was given parts of Palestine, Holy Land, was so cruel he was removed and the Romans began a direct rule. So I just put there on the rest of top of page 2, just this turns now to, you have Jesus, the Pauline mission between 40 and 60, and then the first Jewish revolt against Rome. Momentous. Yeah, Bob.
Jesus was only 26 when he died?
Well, the dates here, he's 34 in this. He's 4 AD, 4 BC. That should be 4 BC. I'm sorry. Yeah, 4 BC. Good for you. Thanks. Yeah. We don't know these exact dates. The Gospels put him being born under Herod, and we know from other sources that Herod probably died at 4 BC. But the calendar here is, yeah. So then Pauline mission and letters. First Jewish revolt, as I say, was chaotic. But this, we'll talk about this was where the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed at the end of this revolt in 70. 73, they took Masada. But one of the most spectacular things we will visit in Jerusalem, and we are among the first generations to ever see it since 70 AD, or since the destruction, is that they've excavated, especially the southern wall of the temple. And you can see both the enormous structure of the temple and the destruction. And not only physically was this a traumatic event, as you can imagine, but what we say symbolically, it changed Jewish identity forever. Also changed early Christianity significantly. From 70 on, the focus of Christianity is turning increasingly to the West, to the Greco-Roman Empire. Within Judaism, what had been focused on the temple and its cult and the priesthood is now a local experience, much more, in the hands of the rabbis, of teachers, and in the family. Okay. It's the family. This is one of the most remarkable things that Judaism did. Where before you only went to the Jerusalem temple on pilgrimage, Passover, Tabernacles, Pentecost, 3 great pilgrimage feasts. Now they're celebrated in the home. Okay. And the father of the household takes the teaching, why is this night different from all other nights? The mother takes the priestly role of purifying the vessels and preparing the altar and so on. So they had a way of continuing these vital identifying festivals that recorded the key events of their religious identity, and to have to, over time, put them into a whole different circumstances by keeping them going. It's really quite remarkable. And it enabled Judaism to survive. There's a great debate we can talk about. Masada has a lot of attention because it was this dramatic resistance to Roman rule. But there's a lot of thoughtful rabbis, some of whom we've had on our faculty, that say the real heroes were not Masada, and that's in the tools of the state of Israel, to try to dramatize this. The real heroes were the people that adapted their way of life and enabled it to continue and did not commit suicide, which is deeply against Jewish instincts and morality. So it's an interesting thought, who were the real heroes that enabled this community to survive? And in a certain way, the same parallel with Christianity. Prior to this, Christianity, in the early chapters of Acts, what did they do? They went to the temple daily to pray. They broke bread in their homes. They were speaking Hebrew. The rulers of if you like, the authorities of the Christian community were in Jerusalem. All of the focus was there. After this, it begins to shift to the west. And you have increasing number of Gentiles and a reorganization also. The temple that was equally as important to the Jewish Christians as it was to the Jews now also becomes a symbolic notion. The temple, the body of Christ is the temple, and so on. They had to work with these symbols to reinterpret them. We'll talk about that because I think it's one of the things that's so evident. So then just skimming down here, Bar Kokhba revolt was the second Jewish revolt. We'll talk about that also. But then you get in from the Byzantine period. This is the movement of the seat of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, to Byzantium, so the Eastern Empire. And this period is the Eastern Empire that from 313 to 628 we'll see so much evidence. This is where Christian pilgrimage begins. It was very difficult to go there prior to this. But this is where you start to have churches. The earliest churches are from this period, and pilgrimage. And Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who's, I have a copy of it there, his guidebook in the Holy Land is probably the most definitive one. It's not the kind of guidebook that tells you about restaurants and hotels, but it's about the sites, And he mentions that all of these shrines that build up, he said, because the imagination of the guides was a match for the questions of the pilgrims. So you would say, where did this happen? They would say, well, right here, He claims that he heard an Arab guide explaining to a group, pointing to a group of stones, said, these are the stones that would have cried out. In Jesus' entrance into the city. I think he's a character. But so the Byzantine period, was a Christian ruling from Rome, not Rome, the Roman Empire from Byzantium. And it's the flowering of the Holy Land, the Holy Sepulchre itself, and so on. These tremendous changes that happen with Constantine coming, and then the rule of the Roman law and Christianized Rome has an impact on this area. But then beginning 638 is the Arab Revolution, Islam coming in, various dynasties there, Umayyad, the Abbasid, Fatimid, up till the next very significant thing, particularly what's going on now, are the Turks in 1070. And they move in Asia Minor, and there's some interludes like the Crusaders. Look at the Crusaders. They're an interlude there. You'll see evidence of their presence there, but roughly they're 100 years out of all this. It's like a bump on a log. It's Western. It's because they were a Western culture trying to impose with military force into this region, and it couldn't stay. And so then you have, again, 1250 moving on, reassertion of Muslim control. And look at the Ottoman Empire, incredible, 1517 to 1917. They feel like they're trying to revive it now, with what's going on. It's interesting. Turkey is such an interesting place. But the influence of the Ottomans is everywhere in this area. And we think of Lawrence of Arabia, the World War I was the end of they allied themselves with the Axis And of course, at the end of the war, they were on the losing side. And then you have 1917, beginning of the British Mandate, along with the French, who are very much in there, carving up the Middle East. This is where really the boundaries of most of these countries were determined at the end of World War I. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel too, a little later. But so these countries, their boundaries are, this is why it's such a problem. You're talking about tribal peoples, situated into arbitrary boundaries. Egypt is different. Egypt is not tribal. Egypt has a national identity and a long history. But all these other regions, most of them are artificial incorporations, and that's why all the tensions going on today, a lot of this stems from the end of World War I, the end of the Ottoman. And then the British Mandate, 1948, State of Israel, Six-Day War, and I just put those two key wars. Six-Day War, of course, Israel took the oil set, took the Sinai, and then Yom Kippur War, Egypt crossed the Suez, and then the negotiated settlement gave Sinai back, and the Golan Heights were also negotiated in 1973. Of course, at this wonderful time when, for digesting the food, the blood leaves the brain and goes to the... So if anybody's tempted to nap, just put your head down on the desk. Remember in grade school, you do that. I'll just point you out to the rest of the group and say, look at that person. Yeah, no snoring allowed, right. So what I thought we would do is looking over just to jump back a little bit into our history, that what's on page 2 there, the historical context of Jesus in the New Testament period, in effect sort of blows up, if you like, or expands what was in the sketchy part above, but from Alexander's time on, because that history from the 3rd century BC has a direct impact on the circumstances of the gospel and the situation in the early church. And I won't go through all of it. Some of we've already talked about, like the big jumps are from Alexander coming there and bringing Hellenistic culture, and particularly the sort of a concept of the city as a center of culture and organization, which really was part of the genius of the Hellenistic world. And so the polis, the notion of the polis, the city. And then also the appreciation of the human body, the human form, both in art but also in athleticism, was something very foreign to Jewish context and very controversial for them. And then drama, art and drama, was something also novel and characteristic of Hellenistic culture. And language. The language initially was, pretty limited in its terms of the ordinary population, but by the time of Jesus, Koine, the common Greek language, was something like English today in these regions. You can, most places, find somebody who will speak English, particularly in Israel and the West Bank. But it's not their native tongue, and it doesn't always represent their cultural perspectives, So you can think when you talk to somebody in English that you're talking the same language, but in a way you may not be. So the veneer of a world culture that was present at the time of Jesus in the form of the Greco-Roman Empire, because Rome was the political power, but Rome, as you know, adapted the Greek culture very much and adjusted it. That veneer covered the Mediterranean world, but underneath it, in in Jesus' time, in Jewish circumstances, it created great tension. It was, in fact, this interaction with Greco-Roman culture, especially intensified maybe 50 years before the birth of Jesus with the Roman Empire coming in, that set the kind of stage, the religious stage in which Jesus operated. On the one hand, you had people that accommodated to this culture, world culture, very easily. You had in Jerusalem the Sadducees who were noted. These would be religious, political, economic elites for whom interaction with Greek culture and so on was very satisfying. The famous historian Josephus, for whom we depend upon so much of the information. And after this trip, you may want to read Josephus if you've never read him. This very extraordinary detail, especially the Jewish wars. But Josephus was educated in Rome. He was Jewish, went to Rome for his education, and came back. Herod the Great had spent a lot of time in Rome and in Greece. So there was I guess it's like back a century or so, Americans with the means to do so would go and study in Paris or somewhere in Europe and so on. So you had this veneer, and you had groups like the Sadducees, like some of the priestly class, some of the wealthier class that accommodated to this form, these cultural forms. But you had other people who found them incompatible with Jewish values. And one group, for example, very important, are the Pharisees. The Pharisee in Hebrew, parash, means to separate. That's what the word farash, it's a different way you could spell it, Pharisee. And this was a lay reform movement, objecting to the compromises that they saw taking place under the Hasmonean dynasty, the Jewish dynasty that's ruling at this time, and felt that it was really going to destroy the religious identity of Judaism. And the program of the Pharisees was to try to extend, to make accessible, the level of observance that was normally associated with the priests. So that had to do with Sabbath observance, it had to do with diet, it had to do with cultural purity, not to be contaminated by contact with death, and if so, to have to do a ritual bath. And they extended that into the villages. And they also began a program of helping people know, sort of like a casuistry, what was permissible under the law, what was not, so that you could carry this out with integrity. That was their best instincts. And we know from archaeology now, what people didn't know even 15 years ago, that this was probably a highly successful program. In little villages up in Upper Galilee, pretty remote from Jerusalem, humble homes and villages where they had stone vessels that were used for purification, where they had mikvah, these little baths and so on. The ordinary people were, trying to be very observant, whereas people thought that was limited to elites. And the Gospels reflect this. Jesus interacting with the Pharisees about interpretation of law, about questions of Sabbath observance, about purity laws, about diet, and so on. So that was one reaction against Greek culture. Another reaction was what's called the Essene Movement, Essene. And these were a group, almost a quasi-monastic group, that withdrew entirely in protest from participation in the priestly caste that Jerusalem set up. And this most probably is what Qumran, place where I was going in the group will visit, where the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were found on the sea, the shore of the Sea of the Dead Sea, were a group that thought that the corruption that was going on with the adaptation of Greek ways and culture and buying and selling the priesthood and so on, that form of Jewish life was destined for destruction. And they went off into the desert, again, Reform movement, lived a very ascetical life in the desert, and were awaiting God's judgment to come and destroy all the evil, restore life to Israel. And some have associated John the Baptist with this kind of movement. We can talk about that when we're at Qumran, which we visit, which is fascinating. And Qumran had their own set of writings, biblical manuscripts. Some 18,000 different manuscripts have been found. Some fragments, some full texts, found in 1947. Over time, more and more of them discovered and published. It's taken a long time up until recent years when all of this was finally published. But these were writings of a Jewish sectarian group, Qumran, who were part of the reaction setting in. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and you also had, with the coming of the Romans, a more radical group called the Zealots, who believed that they should take up armed resistance against Roman occupation, and would start basically with banditry, raids and bandits and robberies, sort of Robin Hood type of resistance to Roman occupation, which created a great deal of tension, tension that would erupt particularly after 44 AD. So this is after the death of Jesus. Well, Jesus was in a pre-revolutionary period. Okay? But after Herod Agrippa II, who was a Jewish king ruling in this area, the Romans, when he died, instead of putting another Jewish vassal king, they ruled the whole area directly themselves. And that fomented a lot of tension between the Roman authority and the Jewish groups. And eventually in 66 AD, led by sort of this zealot faction, they would revolt against Rome to devastating results. The Romans would brutally suppress the revolt over time. The second time in 132, again, they did it, another revolt that was also even more brutally suppressed. But what I'm trying to say is that the inroads of Greek culture, which accelerated with the coming of the Romans around 60 to 40 BC, as over time they came in, that clash between this world culture and traditional Jewish values led to a fracturing of the Jewish public, a diversification of the Jewish public. Various groups trying to sort out how to respond to this, how to maintain Jewish identity in the midst of all of these powerful forces. Now, ironically, a lot of the same debate is going on right now in Judaism, particularly in Israel. There is tremendous tensions between strictly Orthodox Jewish groups and others more secularized. People estimate that somewhere around 15 to 18% of the population of Israel is observant. Okay? That is to say, keep kosher laws, strict observance of the Sabbath, and so on. There's other large percentage, I would say, of the population that consider themselves Jewish and consider themselves, somewhat observant. but maybe the same way you think of Catholics, maybe there's 30% that go to Mass weekly, and then the rest identify themselves as that, but they're not, as regular, let's say, as the core group. But you have that in Israel, and that's, you may have seen in the papers, the question of military conscription. And the government fell recently, or changed government, and one of the major inroads was made by a candidate who held that they should be drafted in the army. And now they have adopted this law. It's going to be a transition period. And I mention that. I mean, it's the kind of things when we're there we can talk about and hear about from the people we meet. But it's the same thing of what it means to be Jewish. What does it mean to be Jewish? What do you have to do? What are the practices? What are the observances and that was a big issue at the time of Jesus. And that's why it was also some dangerous issues. These kind of discussions about, whether or not you can heal on the Sabbath or do this or that on the Sabbath. These were not just abstract religious debates, but underneath it was the question of your identity as a people. And what did you need to do in order to be a faithful people while under the pressure of a hostile world power whose views, ultimately, whose values were very different from your own. This was a great problem for early Christianity as well, definitely so. And more people who are scholars of the first century and of the New Testament are detecting the resistance elements in the New Testament. Okay? In other words, aspects of the way the Gospels are written that are conscious that they're being written while the Roman Empire is real. The Roman Empire is not an anachronism. They're under the Roman Empire. So what you say about Pilate or what you say about Herod or what you say about Christian reaction with government officials is not a story from the past. It's a story in the present. And so how is this literature going to be received? And what are the consequences for the people that maintain it and so on? So a lot of the tensions in the gospel and some of the controversy and conflicts reflects the particular historical context of the first century. And so that's really that period, if you look in on the bottom of page 2, from the Maccabean Revolt to the Roman occupation. That's that period. And then the Roman occupation and the Herodian dynasty on page 3. I've mentioned a number of these things, that this was, these are the events leading up, setting the stage, if you like, for the gospel. One of the things, by the way, sort of that's interesting, and it's really a kind of aftermath, if you like, of the reconciliation or the rapprochement between Christianity and Judaism, which in the Catholic community has really been strongly led by the last several popes, Pope John Paul II primarily, but also earlier John the 23rd and Benedict also. The inclination to take a more objective look at Judaism, particularly in the context of the first century, has enabled Jewish scholars as well to view the New Testament in a new way. And one of the ironic, if you like, or paradoxical realities is that the Gospels, in terms of the age of the Gospels are the earliest documents we have that speak about Palestinian Judaism. Okay? The Jewish texts all come later. The codification of Jewish texts are like the 3rd and 4th century AD. Their traditions may go back earlier, but the Gospels are written in the 1st century, and they give a view of Jewish life, even though from a Christian perspective. So you have now a number of scholars, Jewish scholars, observant Jewish scholars, who are studying the Gospels to learn about Judaism. It's very interesting. There are several wonderful people, colleagues that I know that are in this. So they're looking at the Gospels and they're seeing this backdrop that I'm trying to put into a historical context. So what's going on, that you have these various conflicts, you have these various factions, you have references to scribes and the Pharisees and Sadducees and so on, priests, the Herodians, are mentioned in the Gospel. All these different groups reflect accurately the historical circumstances of the 1st century. And I don't know what your experience is, but a lot of times, there was, particularly when late 60s, early 70s, there's sort of more freedom of biblical scholarship in the Catholic community, and there was a lot of sensationalism, that the Gospels were more stories that are written and they don't have a lot of historical worth and so on. But the more that archaeology has advanced, the more that there's been a much more thorough analysis of textual and material evidence, the conservative nature, if you like, of the Gospels is much more evident. The Gospels have much more historical credibility, if you like, than people had ascribed to them. Some people thought they were creative theological texts, but not really rooted in the history of the time of Jesus. But the vast majority of biblical and historical scholarship says, yes, of course the Gospels have a theological message. They're our religious text. But the backdrop, the events, the connection with the period of Jesus, there is a very strong historical sinew that binds that together. And I think that's one of the things, by going to Israel and being there, that it sort of confirms that, I had a professor when I was in graduate school at Louvain. He was a brilliant man, but I told him that I was going to go to visit Israel with the School of Archaeology at Louvain. He said, "What are you wasting your time going there for?" He felt that there was no real connection between the place there and the Gospels, that you could read it all in a book. You really didn't need to bother about anything else. So, but anyway, that period. So this stuff is very key. And then just a couple comments, if you will, if you're patient and good. Thank you for this 4th period, Jewish revolt and destruction of Jerusalem. I spoke a little bit about this before we broke. That, there's certain periods in history, we look back, and 9/11, I guess, is one of those, and the dropping of the atom bomb at Hiroshima, and Pearl Harbor, and, there's certain events that become such markers in human history. And often those events, there is a lead up to them and then an aftermath. They're just not standing on their own. There's some kind of tensions building beforehand and then erupts into a kind of event that becomes identifying in this moment. Well, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, destruction of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem, which is described in incredible detail in Josephus, the historian, who was a contemporary of this, that was an enormous turning point. And I had mentioned to you, for Judaism itself to have to reorganize, and without its liturgy, it only had one temple and one temple liturgy and one priesthood and one set of pilgrimage feasts and one identifying place, and it's gone. So what do you do? And their ability to, over time, reorganize under the direction of the Pharisees, really, the direction of the rabbis. Lay movement restored it. And temple's never been restored. You know, there's groups, there's very right-wing Jewish groups, ultra-Orthodox, that want to reestablish the temple. And they make a march on the Temple Mount each year. And of course, everybody knows it's going to happen. All the Israeli police are there, and the Palestinians throw a few stones, and everybody goes away. But for the most part, you know, Judaism is not interested in restoring animal sacrifice and the temple. It's become a different time, but with continuity with the biblical history. And for Christianity, as I say, it was a watershed. There's a very famous article written by Karl Rahner, who was one of the great German theologians, Catholic theologians, a Jesuit at the Second Vatican Council. And after the council, actually in 1979, he gave the commencement address at the Weston School of Theology in Boston, Jesuit school there, now at Boston College. And it was written up as an article. It's called Toward a Basic Theological Understanding of Vatican II. And what he was getting at was underneath all of the different initiatives and documents and things that came out of the council, what was really going on? And to get at it, he says in this article, you can divide all of church history into 3 periods. He said the first period lasted from about 30 AD to 70 AD. And he says this was the Jewish Christian period. So everything, the center was Jerusalem, the language was Hebrew, the moral thinking was Jewish, the liturgy was in the temple liturgy, etc. And then he said the second period, beginning with 70 AD, went from 70 AD to 1968. Okay? And he called this the Hellenistic period. And what he meant, of course, obviously, Western history went through all kinds of dramatic changes, but he said it was all within continuity of Greco-Roman culture. Okay? So now the shift was to Rome, the shift was to Greco-Roman language, European language, architecture, mode of government, liturgy, focus on Rome, not Jerusalem. And that, you know, and no matter where you went around the world before 1968, if you went to Nairobi or you went to Peking, the church would have been European architecture. You would have listened to Latin. The bishop would have been a European or a North American, and so on. And then he says the third period of church history was beginning, as he said, with 1968 from his perspective. And he said this would be the first period in which the church experienced itself as a truly universal church. Okay? And it's just beginning, he said, you know. So now vernacular, local customs, native clergy, so on and so forth. Suddenly there's a diversity of culture and perspectives that Christianity is encountering and embracing. And he went on to say that the strongest analogy from what was happening as we moved from the second period to the third period, in other words, from the Hellenistic period into this new universal period. He says the earliest analogy we have of that is the move from the first period to the second period. From the move from being thoroughly Jewish into the wider Hellenistic world. That the kinds of challenges and tensions that they had of crossing these cultural, linguistic, and religious boundaries, that the analogy to that was what the first century Christians had to negotiate. You know. Does that make sense? You know, I think that.
Are we regressing to Hellenism again?
I don't think so. I think we have Pope Francis is from Argentina, you know, and the southern hemisphere is where all the action is. You know, it's booming. The southern hemisphere is booming. When I was president here, I had a counterpart at there's a something of a union seminary, a Catholic seminary in Nairobi that is similar to CTU, and some of the same religious orders that run CTU run this place in Nairobi. And the rector was visiting here, and we were talking about our experiences and so on. I said, what about enrollment? How's the enrollment challenge? He said, I'll tell you what my enrollment challenge is. A certain diocese will call and say, I'm sending you 5 seminarians. Okay, we can take 5. He goes to the bus station and gets off, and there's 12 of them. So they can't handle them all. I said, well, that's not exactly our problem here in the U.S. regarding priesthood candidates. The lay candidates, yes, but priesthood candidates. So you know what I mean? Like the southern hemisphere, there's a lot of dynamism, and and you go there, and the liturgy and the language. And I was in Tanzania in 1980. The whole Spiritan community who sends their students here have Arusha diocese. They had invited me to come. And I stayed with the last non-Tanzanian bishop in the country. He was from Philadelphia. And he was the last one. And I'm sure there are no more. There are no non-African bishops in the whole continent of Africa. And that's within a period, before the church, there probably would have been no African bishops before 1960. I mean, that's just one little marker, of the change that. So I mention this because one of the things that, when we're exploring Israel, the Holy Land, and so on, I mean, when you think of these people, Paul and others, I mean, they were really navigators like the explorers of old. They were moving into unprecedented circumstances and trying to be faithful, so much of the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, the Gospels, the letters of Paul are really dealing with this transformation they were experiencing. He's writing to these communities and trying to figure out what's the continuity here, between Jesus and his teaching and what a cultural circumstance that Jesus never encountered, nor did the first disciples encounter. And we'll see that. We'll see the mix of cultures that are in this place today as they were back then. So it's, from this point of view, I mean, I think it's instructive. A story I would just share with you. It's particularly so with the Jewish-Christian relations. John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, visited Israel, if you remember, in 2000, the start of the new millennium. And he went to part of his personal program for the observance of the millennium was to go to the Holy Land. And he came to Jerusalem, and friends that I have there, all said the same thing, that at first, they see a lot of foreign visitors come through. And, I remember talking to one Jewish teacher, and I said, what this is early on, what do Jews think of Jesus? He said, not much. And what he meant was not a low estimation, but they just don't think about it. How much do we think about the chief rabbi, or something like that? So when John Paul II came, there was interest, but it was on television. It was thoroughly televised, but there wasn't much public interest. But two things happened. One is he visited President Wiseman, who was a very beloved figure. I think he died within a few months of the Pope's visit. And the Pope's interaction with him was so warm. The Pope was very ill himself at that time with Parkinson's, but there was a kind of rapport between these two men that was very evident. And then he went to the wall, to the Kotel, Western Wall, and put in this prayer of reconciliation. And when he walked up, he was very infirm, had his cane. It just touched people very deeply. So suddenly, viewership of his visit skyrocketed. And the next thing that he did, next major thing during his time there, was to visit Yad Vashem, which we'll also visit. This is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. And it's a very, almost like a park with many memorials, both to Jews that lost their lives, but also to the Gentile rescuers. It's very beautiful the way so many names and memories of people that helped Jews during the time of the Second World War. Anyway, there's a place of eternal flame with ashes of the victims there, and Pope John Paul II, along with Ehud Barak, the prime minister, came there. And they had lined up along the side of this large, sort of somber room, some dignitaries, special people that had connection to the Pope. One was a Jewish rabbi from Krakow, where he was bishop, who knew him, a family friend who was Jewish, and there was a woman there, and the Pope came over to see these people before he laid his wreath on the eternal flame, and he greeted each of these people. And he came to this, I saw this visual, saw the video, came to a woman who, and when he met her, he just like stepped back, and then they had this embrace. This woman was a woman he rescued. He's an official rescuer. At Yad Vashem, there is the archives of the Holocaust, that they keep track, and they also keep track of people that officially rescued. And the Pope, this incident with the woman who was there, he was an assistant pastor at a little town outside of Krakow. And they just liberated the camps, and they were trying to get the people who were in the camps who were so malnourished, they were bringing them to like nourishment centers, they call them, where they could try to save their lives. A lot of them, even after they're liberated, they lost their lives. They were just too far gone. And he was there, and saw this young woman stumbling and falling, walking along a railroad track, trying to get to the train that would take her to the center in Krakow. So he, encountered her and realized how weak she was, and he put her over his shoulder, and he carried her to the train. And when he got there, the train was not going to leave for a while. He had like a clerical cloak, and he put that around her, and he went off to somewhere, a home or something, to get tea and some bread and cheese. Gave it to her, and then rode with her on the train in this freight car. And when they got to Krakow, he got off the train. She was supposed to be met by some relatives that were still there, an aunt or something like that. So he got off to try to find them. And while he was off going, they discovered their niece. And she was telling them that this priest had helped her, and they became very frightened. They thought he was going to try to take her. So he comes back. They got off the train and hid sort of in the station, and they could hear him calling her name. And she wanted to respond, but they said, no, you can't do it. So he didn't find her. And that was in 1945. And when he became Pope, he got a note from this woman who recognized his name. She had said she had written his name down so she would not forget him. And she was in Canada. She was head of B'nai B'rith. And she wrote to him, and he had gotten the note, but and then he met her. That was her at this. And it just was so, this emotional gripping of these two people. So immediately after, the Pope went over and put his wreath on and said a few words about forgiveness. And Prime Minister Barak, who's the text of his talk I have, was very profound, I thought. And he started off, he said, Holy Father, by your presence here and your comportment, 2,000 years of history have come full term. I thought that's 2,000 years of relationship between our peoples, you know. And so that is really maybe a shaggy dog story, but I think it personalizes what is really true, the rapprochement of reconciliation, you know, through all of these terrible ups and downs. And the earliest, you know, you come back by going to Israel, you come back to our Jewish roots, you know. I mean, this is really essential for us. Unrecognized, even paradoxically becoming hostile, mutually hostile like siblings over many centuries. Probably, you know, the Holocaust was certainly not a Christian activity as such, but a lot of Christians were involved. And the anti-Semitism of centuries dripping into the lifeblood of Europe, you know, certainly didn't prevent it, you know. And so anyway, that's this, what we're talking about here, about the separation, you know, with the 70 AD and the ultimate distancing, you know, of this, that in many ways it's coming back. You know? The connection between the two communities are coming back. And you have on the part of Christians recognizing Judaism not as a stereotype, but more about what its religious values were and how much of that Jesus represented and loved. And Jewish scholars, I'd say in a less percentage at this point, are beginning to see in Jesus and the Gospels a reflection of their own tradition, the best of their own tradition. So it's rather unusual time, I think, for us. It's one of the blessings of this time, with all the other problems we have. But it's this history that really, you know, that's what Rana was talking about, you know, that movement, so from Judaism into the wider cultural world, is matching what we're experiencing, I think, as a Christian movement, almost all the major denominations, and also in another way doubling back and picking up our Christian, what did I do? I messed up something. I don't really need them, Andy. That's okay. That's okay. We don't really need the maps at this point. So take a look, if you would, and we'll make this sort of bring it to our close here. On page 4, sort of the aftermath. And some of this I've already said, you know, the end of the aftermath, what happened in 70, it ended Jerusalem as the liturgical center for Judaism, and also had an effect on Jewish Christianity, you know. And then, you know, the emergence, the role of the synagogue. We'll visit some early synagogues that were really, you know, from the first century. These small neighborhoods, the synagogues are not like temples. They're small. There's hardly any of them as big as this room. You know, they're neighborhood, they're small gatherings, they're familial, familiar. And the home, the Jewish home, the family, became increasingly important as the carrier of religious traditions. Probably Christianity could learn something from this, you know. And then, as I put there, reorganization of Judaism under the Pharisaic party. Jamnia, I put there Jamnia. Jamnia was a gathering of Jewish sages and rabbis that helped reorganize Jewish law and codify it and customs, and helped with this process of survival. And then there was a second revolt against Rome. This one, in fact, was more religious. The first Jewish revolt was somewhat chaotic and haphazard, spontaneous combustion. And a lot of the rebels, if you like, Jewish rebels, were unsavory characters. There's all kinds of factions among themselves, killing each other and so on. It was really maybe something like what's going on in Syria, where you have all these different groups thrown together, united by opposition, but not united among themselves. But the second Jewish revolt was very religious in its orientation. Bar Kokhba, the leader of it, means the son of the star. And it's a text taken from Leviticus, or Numbers, from Numbers. I see a star, not yet, a star rising. And he really tried to make this a religious motivation. But it was brutally suppressed by the Romans. And this is where Jerusalem was razed to the ground. Its name was changed to Aelia Capitolina, and no Jew could go there. It's really the city, the old city of Jerusalem that we will visit many times, is laid out according to the post-132. It's laid out as a Roman city. Okay. So the original, the city that Jesus knew, is underneath somewhere. One of the things in the group that's going that we go to first is an extraordinary model of Herodian Jerusalem that's at a very large scale. You can sort of almost walk among it, in which they've tried to reconstruct Jerusalem from the time of Jesus. It's very instructive. We try to go there first and you can get situated. But the city, as we'll see it, and its walk on the streets, are laid out according to a classical Roman city, and it relates from 132 AD. Now, as I mentioned, some of the things that were happening in the early church, we can say the death of Christ somewhere around 30. You had the death of Stephen mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. The first persecution of the Christians breaks out around 36, 37. Conversion of Paul. Some people think Paul was born in 8 AD, but we can't be sure. Just right, shortly after the birth of Jesus. Council of Jerusalem, the first gathering, which was really about negotiating these cultural boundaries, what would be imposed on Gentile converts. Raymond Panikar, the great Jesuit theologian who just died a couple years ago, said, if we have another ecumenical council, it should not be Vatican III, but Jerusalem II. In other words, our problems, our challenges are like the first council, how to deal with diverse cultures and perspectives. Death of Paul around 67, 68, so he died before the destruction of the temple, before the Jewish revolt was probably starting, and then 70 AD. And then 80 to 90, and some would even press that later into the first century, the gradual separation from the synagogue. Christians, Jewish Christians, like those that probably wrote the Gospel of Matthew, for example, it's hard for us to enter into their perspective. But I have no doubt they thought of themselves, if you said, what's your religious identity? They would say Jewish. Jewish follower of Jesus, but I'm Jewish. Okay, I'm not a Christian. They didn't know the word. It says in Antioch they were first called Christians by the outsiders. But their self-identity was Jewish, and they thought they were the real Jews because they were following Jesus the Messiah. Okay? And as one scholar put it, I like what he had to say, was that the challenge for the Jewish Christians at this point was not their relationship with Judaism. It was their relationship with the Gentiles. They had no doubts about their relation to Judaism. They were Jewish. But how do we absorb these non-Jews into the picture? That was their challenge. Now our challenge is, how do we relate to Judaism? But it's the opposite of what they had, in their time. And so you come down to the end of the New Testament era, around the end of the first century. Some would say around 125. Some of the New Testament books, 2 Peter and so on, may be written. So then I put down beneath what we were just saying, there's centrality of Jerusalem and Jewish Christianity, in the 30s and 40s. then gradual emergence of Gentile Christianity, increased influence of Hellenism, and then from 70 on, increased development of church structures. You know, a lot of them they borrowed from the synagogues. That's what they knew. The names for officials and elders, presbyters, priests, you know, this is all from Jewish structures and overseers, and naturally, what else would they do? You know, this was what they knew. And then that third lineup is the New Testament literature, the third under the dotted line there. So you had, you know, the letters of Paul are coming roughly between 50 and 67 or so. And then the first gospel, Mark's gospel, most people is written either right before or right after the destruction of Jerusalem, around 70 AD, the first of the gospels to be written. So this material is alive in the Christian community. The stories are being kept alive. The sayings of Jesus are memorized. It's an oral culture. And it's being used in the church's catechesis, in its preaching, in its moral debates. But what happens, the gospel writer, the tendency of the material was to be centrifugal as it moved out into the wider world, carried by the memory and the interaction and interpretation of the early community. But at a certain point, the gospel writer puts it into writing, codifies it. So it goes in a different direction, constricts the development of the materials and puts them into a narrative. And even to be able to do a narrative like this may have been one of the influences of Greek culture. They knew about drama, they knew about narrative and so on. A lot of people speculate about this. So then you start to have Mark, and then in the 80s and 90s, Matthew and Luke. John's Gospel, many put the final edition of John towards the end of the first century. And then scattered along the way, other New Testament writings, Hebrews, the pastorals, and so on, the book of Revelation. So you have this evolution, first century, sort of this incubation period, if you like, of sort of the definitive formation of the church's New Testament. The scriptures for the early Christians was what we call the Old Testament. That was their Bible, that was their scriptures. The New Testament materials emerge as the reflection on Jesus by the early community happens and becomes, another thing that's going on here towards the end of the first century, particularly into the second century, is what we call the formation of the canon. The church, in its instinct, deciding what are our sacred books? What are the books that really define us? And what are the books that don't define us? Because there are all kinds of writings about Jesus and about Christianity. You have to Dan Brown. You have to read to get the scoop on this. He should be thankful for he's probably made millions off of the Mary Magdalene. But there was other, Luke says this in his prologue. Many people have set out, he said, to write an account of the things that happened among us. But I wanted to do it in an orderly fashion. So there were. But the church, what was very key, I think one of the most key criteria, was what were the texts they used in worship? What were the texts that they read at their liturgies? And that really became a kind of filter, if you like, that helped determine what were the sacred books as distinct from other books. And that has to do with reception. In other words, the Christian, it was not a matter of somebody writing and saying, I'm a gospel writer, so here it is. No, it was like, how does this sound to us who are people of faith? Do we receive this? It's like if somebody gets up on a Sunday morning and reads a text that is alien, people are going to say, wait a minute, where did this come from? but the instincts of the Christian community over time sort of sorted out which text really spoke to them about who Jesus was and what Christian faith meant. So down below there I put, and I'll leave a little time for if you have any comments or questions, especially the second one, the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. People make that distinction. You know, the Jesus of history is the human being who walked the roads of the Holy Land, you know, Nazareth and Capharnaum and Jerusalem and so on, the first third of the first century. And what is the connection between that figure and the Christ portrayed in the Gospels, you know, who is one who heals and teaches and dies and is raised from the dead? I mean, that's the great question, the credible connection between the historical reality of Jesus and the portrayal of Jesus, the cumulative portrayal in the New Testament. Okay? And the perspective of faith is that, granted, the Gospels have a lot of interpretation in them, a lot of, you know, attempts to understand Jesus and titles for him, that there is continuity between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Okay? Not everybody affirms that, you know, but that is the instinct of certainly of Catholic tradition and other traditions. And then, you know, the other thing is here I put God's word and human words, the incarnational nature of the Bible and its interpretation. This is very important. I mean, there's a human dimension to the scriptures. It's written in a particular language. The different gospel writers have different literary capacities. They have different styles. They're writing in different contexts. They're responding to different problems. They make grammatical mistakes. They make scientific mistakes. They go according to their worldview, you see. It's incarnation. It's, you know, Jesus was not born an abstract human being. He was born a first century Palestinian Jew, you know. So he didn't know a thing about cell phones or, you know, or computers or spaghetti or whatever, you know what I mean? It's just, the limitations of your time and place is what is taking incarnation seriously. But there's a transcendent dimension to this that goes beyond time and place. And so the Gospels, this is what, you know, again, I'm speaking from a Catholic tradition, but it's not uniquely so. You know, other traditions, Christian traditions would espouse the same thing. But to say that the scriptures, although they are a sacred text, we can bring to the study of the scriptures everything we bring to the study of Shakespeare. You know what I mean? Knowing literary forms, studying language, studying the narrative, studying the plot, studying the background, because they're human words. It's God's word in human words. So there's a human dimension, a serious human dimension, just like Jesus' own humanity was a serious humanity. It was an authentic humanity, even though also a divinity. So the scriptures are God's word in human words, and that's, you know, like biblical scholarship is sort of based on this. So I can study the history, I can study, you know, compare Matthew's Greek to Mark, and I can, you know, try to figure out why this text comes before this text, or where did they get this hymn that they've included in here. Those are all, in a sense, literary analysis questions, but they help us to understand more of the text, and they're justified because of, you know, the incarnation, if you like, because these are human texts. And then, as I put, the modern impact of biblical geography and history. What we started out with is something that is a very strong emphasis now in archaeology and studies. You know, at one point in biblical archaeology, which is a rather young science, it really goes back pretty much in Napoleonic times, but especially the British in the 19th century is where in Israel they really started to have interest. And their interests were in finding royal palaces, monumental buildings, and so they would dig down to find the temple and whatever it would be. Nowadays, archaeologists say, well, that's interesting, but the real thing is, how did ordinary people live? So their interest, they would go much more ecstatic if they find a garbage dump, an ancient garbage dump, and then you can tell what the diet of the people was. Or to find a cemetery, analyze the bones and see what diseases they had or how their teeth were. You know what I mean? Like it's a democratization in a way. It's into the ordinary circumstances of how people live. There's much more interest in this on the part of science and archaeology. And I think we're all to the benefit. I mean, most people didn't live in palaces. They lived in little modest structures, and so they examined sewage lines. Honestly, you hear some of these guys go ecstatic that they found a sewer from the 1st century, so they can find all the stuff in there. But it's a wonderful, it's cumulative now, the portrait of how people lived in the 1st century is much clearer, and therefore how Jesus and his disciples lived. We have much more ideas about their diet, about their circumstances, their life expectancy, their customs, the kind of clothing they wore, the kind of way of life they led, a daily life. And after all, that's really, that's where you get more of a feel for what's going on. Jesus was not a royal in that sense. He was an ordinary person, lived with the ordinary people. So anyway, that's our deal. You've been wonderfully patient. I don't know if there are any final protests, questions, murmurs. Yeah?
I have a question. I don't want to keep everybody for it.
No, it's okay. We got a couple minutes, yeah.
When you were talking about the Jewish Christians versus the Jews that historically are still today, what created the rift that people didn't embrace Jesus the way we do?
Well, it's
he
a very,
was a
yeah.
prophet, but he was not divine. Isn't that the sort of the distinction you believe?
Oh, you mean that would be their belief if they had, yeah. Well, that probably is true. A lot of those who are knowledgeable of Jesus, Jewish people, would say that he was a fine Jewish teacher, but not what Christians claim. So, I mean, the biggest thing today separating Jews and Christians is precisely that one. Jesus. Jesus is, what do you ascribe to Jesus? What identity? Back there, there's a very interesting document that the Pontifical Biblical Commission brought out a couple of years ago. It's called The Jewish People and Their Scriptures in the Christian Bible. And it takes up this question. We could imagine a scenario in which there was one idea of what the Messiah would be. We had, in a sense, sort of his resume. And everybody was poised to see when this person would come along. Jesus comes along, and he's got all the points of the resume plus, and they miss it. So that's like a position of, say, of clarity and missed opportunity. But more than likely, it was much cloudier than that. There was debate among Jews at the time of Jesus who and what the Messiah would be. And some people did encounter Jesus and say, this is my hopes and dreams fulfilled. You are the Messiah of Israel. But others, either who is this guy, or he's treading on my lawn, or he's, your religious teacher, I think he's teaching heresy. He's hanging out with the wrong people. He's not observant. Conflict. And then the role of the leadership, I think, was important. The Gospels put the finger on the leadership, that the leaders rejected Jesus for all the reasons we're just saying. And the people sort of go with the flow. So I think it was a much murkier situation. And then as time develops and the Christian movement grows, you have points of friction. Like when Paul would go out on his mission into the Asia Minor or to Greece, as a Jew, he went first to the synagogue to preach, and he would preach his message. And in the synagogue, there were observant Jews, the core community, and there were also, we know, Gentiles. They call them God-fearers, who were enamored of Judaism's morality. They liked that it was an ancient religion, which was very important to the Greco-Roman world. And so they came to Sabbath observance, but they didn't become Jews. Okay? They didn't want to be circumcised if they're male. They didn't want to have to do all the diet and everything else, but they still admired Judaism, and they were welcome in the synagogue. Paul comes in, preaches. A lot of the core group say, we'll hear you on this another time. The Gentiles say, perfect. You know, this is what I've been looking for, you know, all this time. So that you have an Acts that God-fearers come flocking in. Well, how do you think the regular community, especially when they pass the collection around and say there's a lot less people here this Saturday? I don't know, I'm not making that part up, but you could see how it could be a point of tension, drawing off of these folks. So the splitting of communities, and then growing tensions, and it erupts into the 2nd and 3rd, 4th centuries. You know, some of the Christian leaders are very anti-Semitic. Some of the people we recognize as saints or John Chrysostom, Chrysologus, some of the things they say about the Jews are just terrible. These are their sermons. You know? So you really were in a situation where you know, the poison began in many places between the two groups, and that's what Ehud Barak meant. The 2,000 years of history has come full term, the relationship between our people, because it was 2,000 years pretty much of enmity. You know, not always, but a lot of it was enmity, and so anyway, it's providence to. Yeah.
You've had Jewish people study here.
Yes.
Right? Have you ever had Jewish people going on your trips to Israel?
I don't think so. One person really wanted to go, Marshall Bennett, but no, I don't think so. We have not on my trips, in January, CTU runs an intensive called Abraham's Children. And the students for students. And there's Jews, Muslim, and Christian students, and the faculty includes rabbi, imam, and one of our Catholic professors. So they're together, they're studying, and they go to synagogue, and they go to mosque, and they go to Christian stuff. It's really marvelous that they're doing this.
What did the Jewish students here get out of the study of Jesus in the New Testament?
Well, as I was mentioning before, the New Testament, both particularly the Gospels, but also Paul and the other, are the earliest texts we have that speak about Judaism. So a couple of motivations. One is they would study to learn more about their own heritage. And the second is they would study the same way that we have students who do Islamic studies or Jewish studies, so that they can understand it better and represent it more fairly to their own people. So this is a phenomenon that's happening, which, you know, with all the other stuff that's going on, this is a grace that's happening. We got a grant this past year of Anne Marie's help from the Luce Foundation that is going to pay for a number of scholarships for the people that staff the Niagara Foundation. The Niagara Foundation is not a foundation in the way you think of granting money. It's a Turkish organization that's dedicated to interreligious harmony. They have a big operation here in Chicago. They want to send their staff members here, their key staff members, to learn more about Christianity so they can do their work among the Turks. And part of that is their interest in Turkish relationship to Europe. They feel if they know more about Christianity, they'll know more about Europe. Isn't it interesting? These cross fertilizations that were unheard of just a few decades ago. And now it's a lot of young people are interested in this. We have an MA in interreligious dialogue in which they study, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity primarily. It's our most popular MA program. These are mainly Catholic students coming, but they're very interested in this. They just sense that this is very important for the future of the world. Particularly the Muslim-Christian relationship is so critical. We're just half the world's population right there. So.